Diana is the Executive Director of Food Secure Canada, a McConnell grantee, I would add, with a background in journalism and human rights. More recently, she worked with technology watchdog the ETC Group, known globally for its work in supporting food sovereignty and biodiversity. Her remarks today will address the absence of a national food policy, the need for a national student nutrition strategy, and the federal government to become active in bringing together all levels of government, along with the private sector and local actors, to address food insecurity. Please welcome Diana Bronson.
Thanks very much. Thanks to CFICE for organizing this event, and thanks to everybody who's presented before me. I feel it's always interesting to speak last. You try and strike things off, but in a way they all get replaced with more things you want to say. So apologies for that. I'll try and keep to my time so that we can have some discussion. I do want to focus mainly on the budget, because I think that's what we advertise for this event, and I'd like to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty. I just would like to say a few things about Food Secure Canada before I go into my remarks. Food Secure Canada is a network of organizations and individuals brought together around three main priorities. That is zero hunger, healthy and safe food for all, and sustainable food systems. And of course, you could unpack every one of those three things. And we do a little bit in this publication, which is outside, which Kathleen alluded to. It's called Resetting the Table, a People's Food Policy for Canada. And this really was an exercise in deliberative democracy that Peter Andre talked about, where some 3,500 people over about 3 years brought together at kitchen table talks across the country, worked, as farmers and activists and people operating student nutrition programs and gardeners and cooks, brought their collective wisdom together and designed what could be and what should be a food policy for Canada. Of course, we wouldn't expect the government to necessarily adopt everything in the People's Food Policy, but we do think it's a very good starting point. And nor is it the only discussion on food policy in town, and perhaps we can get into that in the table, in the debate. Well, Kathleen says we have a national food policy, and that's one way to say it. I would say we don't have a national food policy. What we have is a haphazard patchwork of policies put together in various government silos, where the obvious connections that need to be drawn between agriculture and health and environment and trade, just to mention those four, are not being drawn. And these policies are not being thought of together. And that is turning out to be very, very costly in the long term. I actually have a piece in iPolitics this morning that lays out what some of those costs are. For example, just to cite one figure, the diet-related chronic diseases in Canada cost our economy roughly $93 billion. We could do a lot better with fairly modest resources if we would start talking about healthy diets more systematically throughout our society, and helping along, as Kathleen pointed out, the producers of food, the producers of healthy food, who are going out of business at an alarming rate. So as an organization that convenes organizations and interested individuals across the country around these three priorities, we decided to try and tackle the federal budget this year for reasons you all know very well, and that Idle No More has brought home in a very clear way to all of us. The federal budget is the most important piece of legislation that the federal government passes in any given year, I would argue, or in most given years. One could conceive of other equally important pieces of legislation, but particularly with what we pack into it these days, the federal budget is a crucial piece. So what is happening, what is not happening, and what should be done? Well, what is not happening is a federal food policy or a process that would lead us towards one. This was part of the Conservative Party's platform in the last election. In fact, it was part of the party platforms of all 5 parties in the House of Commons to have a national food policy. But there's been no process of engagement. If you consult the lobbying records of some of our biggest food companies, you can see that they're still lobbying the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food for a national food policy, but there is no public discussion whatsoever on the government side about what is going on in terms of a national food policy. Indeed, the government seems to have transformed itself into a stakeholder of an industry-led process, which is run by the Conference Board of Canada. And you may have heard the recent consultations that the Conference Board is holding on its so-called national food strategy, and they'll be having a big summit in April in Toronto. But the government, or certain government departments, both provincial and federal, actually sit around that table more as stakeholders rather than conveners of a process, which is what we think they should be. So we called in our submission, in our electronic submission, and then before the Committee on Finance when we were invited to appear, for the establishment of a cross-sectoral, multi-stakeholder dialogue that would begin a conversation about how to bring these issues together. Now, in an era when the government seems intent on becoming smaller and is not exactly forward-looking when it comes to federal policy or federal standards or federal leadership, I'm not holding my breath that that's going to happen, even though it's quite obvious to me that that would be the right thing to happen. But even in the absence of a dialogue towards a national food policy that we desperately need, there are small steps that could be taken that would make a big difference and that we would like to see in the federal budget when it comes down, presumably in March. I don't think a date has yet been announced. And we've written up some of these ideas for the first time this year. I don't know how many people in the room know of the alternative federal budget? Yeah, a few people, so that's good. So the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has done that for a number of years. They've put forward an alternative federal budget, and this year it will have the first ever chapter on food. So we're trying to work on the alternative side as well, to actually cost out and budget what would be required to turn food policy a little bit around. And we had an assembly of our membership in Edmonton, and one of the resounding conclusions of that assembly was that if we could not move anything else forward, perhaps we could move forward this idea of a national, federally led student nutrition program. These programs exist all over OECD countries, indeed in many countries that are not OECD countries. And basically what they do is provide kids in elementary and in secondary schools with either a breakfast or a mid-morning snack. The research is quite unanimous on the benefits of such programs. We know that 40% of elementary school students and 60% of high school students don't eat breakfast before going to school, and that actually inhibits their learning. It causes more students to drop out. It makes them less concentrated. It reduces their capacity of their memory to function properly. And it doesn't cost very much. And all across this country, we have programs that are led by school boards and communities and parents. There's private sector actors, the municipalities and the provincial governments are all involved right across the country. But there's no federal contribution. So what Food Secure Canada called upon the federal government to do was its fair share, which would be to pick up 20% of the costs, which would allow those programs to serve better food to more kids who need that food to learn properly during the day. So we costed that out, and for 20% of the cost of the program, we figure for about $550 million, which I know sounds a lot to people in this room, but it's not really that much in terms of the overall federal budget. We could make a significant difference in expanding these programs. And of course, they should be sourcing local food and healthy food and not serving up junk to kids in the morning. We came up with a number of other recommendations as well. For example, we talked a little bit here about local procurement and the benefits of that to local economies. The federal government, buys an awful lot of food, particularly in this town. Why would they not begin to set targets for federal government agencies that a certain percentage of their food should be sourced locally from local farmers? Why not support organizations like Local Food Plus, who is a member of Food Secure Canada, that certifies local food not only for its environmental but also for its social impacts? Why not help by setting up the infrastructure and the marketing and the farmers markets and all of those things that would make local food easier? There's a cross-Canada coalition called Farm to Cafeteria Canada that's doing very, very interesting work in trying to get schools and so on to buy more local food. But instead, as you've probably heard, we are negotiating trade agreements that are actually going to undermine the capacity of municipalities to give preferential access to their markets to local farmers or local food producers. Another thing that we could be doing much, much better than we are is supporting family farms. We've quadrupled our exports, and we've lost 2/3 of our family farms in the post-war period. We've got bigger and bigger farms growing fewer and fewer things. 75% of farmers want to pass it on in the next 10 years. The average age of a farmer in Canada is 54. None of this is a sign of a healthy agricultural economy. We need to create programs to make it possible for young people to go into farming. It's very, very tough for young people to get access to the credit they need if they are interested in farming. We need to have some net income targets for farmers. It's not enough to just have insurance when there's crop failures. We need to know that all farmers can meet a basic core minimum standard. And there needs to be retirement saving programs and other financial supports for farmers, for all farmers, not just the big ones. We also came up with some recommendations on Nutrition North, and I think Terry has spoken in some detail about the problems of food security in the North. I think it's true that it's a new program, and the jury is very much out. I understand it's going to go through an evaluation in the coming year. I hope that's an evaluation that will solicit the input of all the different stakeholders who are very, very interested in that program. 70% is a shocking, shocking statistic for food insecurity in the North. In fact, the statistics are quite shocking across the country. 17% for the average Indigenous adult in this country. 3.9 million Canadians who experience some form of food insecurity, 2.1 million Canadians who experience severe or moderate food insecurity, according to the research of Val Tarasek, who's also participating in this project. So we have a lot of work to do, and we're working in quite a difficult context. So I don't want to leave with a depressing note of where we're at. I do thank you very much for coming this morning. I hope you find our presentations informative. I invite you to continue to connect with Food Secure Canada. Individuals and organizations are most welcome to be members. Like all nonprofits, and despite McConnell's very generous and wonderful and much appreciated support, we do work on a shoestring, and we're not in a position like the conference board where we can hire economists left, right, and center and expensive consultants and so on. So we'd be delighted to work with students and professors to help turn around the kind of research that we need, that we don't have time to do in our daily lives, and that's one reason why CFICE is such a valuable initiative to us. So I'd like you to sign up for our newsletter list outside. I'd like you to consider becoming a member of Food Secure Canada. If you're a student and not an income earner, as they say, you can do it for $10. Otherwise, it's $30. I'd also like you to invite you to participate in the interactive webinar that we're going to hold with the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food right after he delivers his final report on Canada to the United Nations, and to participate in that conversation with us. And there too, I must thank Carleton for its very, very generous support, passing its big blue button technology into this international dialogue. It's really making it possible not only for academics, but for people who use food banks, who work in community centers, who are living with food insecurity, to participate in a dialogue with people who are discussing this in Geneva, at the Palais des Nations, in circumstances that they're not at all familiar with. So I do hope you'll get involved, and I thank you very much for listening to my comments.